Greetings. By the end of this tutorial, you would have had an application that looks like this, that is basically created with Banana Server. I'd like to make a disclaimer that the information used in this particular tutorial has been generated from fake data, because you'll see contact information here, but it has been generated from fake data, and there is code in our code base that shows how that information has been generated. So what basically you are seeing here is an app running on localhost 8080. Address book is the name of our application, and that's the page that it is running from, index.html. Now, this application is running basically using the JT web server, aka Banana server. And what we've done is to create an application that is a full stack web application where you are able to create provinces, where you are able to create categories, where you are created contacts. This is fake information, and also where you are able to view the dashboards. Like, for example, what's happening here, the contacts, provinces, and categories are counted from the categories that are available there. That's 15. And in our dashboard, you see 15. Our contacts is 5. You see 5 contacts here. And then in our dashboard, you have 21 provinces, and then our provinces are 21. So this application is also able to generate Excel reports. For example, you click here, and then you're able to generate Excel reports that are generated by the system. So it's an end-to-end system where, for example, you're able to capture the information and also generate reports. Now, if you've been following up in relation to some of our applications that we've been creating for CRUD application, we always follow the same premise. You start an application, and then you end it up with reporting, which is what is basically we have done here. So we try as much as possible to follow the same methodology in relation to creating our application, so that at the end of the day, they're easy to follow. We try not to change the code base as much as possible, so that you kind of like see familiarity in relation to what you are basically using. So we've seen the dashboard, we've seen the provinces. Like, for example, here, if you click on add, you're able to add a province here. The province has been added, which is Northern Cape. And then we are able to do a search here. And then what you're able to do also is to edit it. For example, you can change it to Northern Cape 1, and then it changes. And then if we do a search, there it is. We are also able to delete it. You click yes, and then it's no longer available. And we're also able to clone it, to create a clone of a record. Northwest is 0. Then I'm able to clone a record here. So Northwest 0, there it is. So the same thing that happens with provinces is the same thing that happens with categories. You add a category, service providers X, you choose a color for a category here, and then you click on save, and then it's going to be saved. So this is useful where, for example, you want to capture information about categories that are actually going to be color coded. That's us using the color code for the schemes here. Like, for example, if you want to categorize your expenses, you can categorize them by color and all sorts of things. The contacts, these contacts are basically built from big data. For example, these are all the C's, like Castro Helper. These are all the F's, Fitzpatrick. These are all the S's and all sorts of other things. This is an alpha chooser, and this is a column chooser. Column chooser, for example, if you want to hide the full name, if you want to show the telephone and all sorts of other things. So as I've indicated, the information that is generated from fake data. What we do, as soon as we add, it kicks in our fake data generator, and then it gives us an example of a particular contact. Then you can choose the category, then you can choose the gender, then you can choose the province. Now, in most of the cases when you're developing web applications, you use your selects, and that will be related to other information that is there. So that is why we're showing this relationship between the various tables, because this information that is here is from provinces, this one is from categories. At the same time, you can click on add here, and then you'll ask to add a category, X, for example, and then you save it, there it is. And then here, you can also add a province, I don't know. I'm just making an example. So there it is. So we'll just streamline the example as much as you can so that when you add something here, it's default. But basically, I'm just showing you how you can create relationships between the different tables. And as I've indicated, fake data generated the data. So for test purposes and also for other things. So now let's go back in terms of looking in terms of now that we've created an app and it's running on our application, and you can deploy it on a VPS or internally, because applications from Banana Server are created and deployable on VPS or internally. So let's see in terms of how this application has been developed and why is it different from other applications that we've been developing before. Now, as you can see, this is the chart in relation to the first letter of the alphabet of the person, and then this is basically the gender split. Now, our application has been developed using B4J and Banano and Citasso Daisy, and then some of the built-in libraries in relation to how we do that. For example, Banano Server, Byte Converter, Hikari for the backend connections in relation to the database pulling, Java Object, JCore, and JSON and JSQL. So what we've done is to define different parameters in relation to what we want to connect with. But for now, we want to connect to MySQL. I have not done the other connection parameters here in relation to coding the REST API. So the application itself is using a REST API. Well, thanks to Eric in relation to providing us with the mini ORM and also the connectors and all sorts of other things in relation to making this particular project possible. So let's look in terms of the source code. So we're using MySQL as a backend. So you don't need to have Laravel for this. We can just install MySQL, and then it needs to be running on your computer, and then you just provide the connection settings. The connection settings that the application is using is sitting on the config properties file. So you just change them there and everything else will work properly and connect to a database that is in your machine. So these are the additional libraries that are needed for this, connectors and all sorts of other things. And then in relation to the user interface itself, I'm going to close this because this is already running, but I'm not going to stop it from running. For example, we started the application here. It started the logs in relation to what it was doing and starting. And then here, check the database. Our database is in localhost. That's the port, that's the username and password. You don't want to log these things, but because we were testing and I wanted to demonstrate this, then at the end of the day, I needed to show these things. Now, with Banana Server, you need to define it in process globals because that is what we're using. Basically, Banana Server is a normal city server, but just for Banana purposes. Now, if you've been watching our applications before, we use PG index as the starting point of our applications. There are other address books like these ones that we've created, and in most of the cases, we'll find out that the starting point for our application after Banana already is PG index. Now, the entry point for our application is PG index here, but it is a browser app. Look, Banana Server uses prefixes that you need to use. For example, anything that is going to be running on the browser must have a prefix of browser, that is the client side. And anything that is going to be working on the server, it must have a prefix of server, that is the server side. Basically, where the server is B4J code, you can write it as is. But where the browser is, you cannot write a a code that it needs to run on the server. You need to write code that is going to run on your browser, that is on the client side. So what we've defined here is to define a server or a RAM connector, because that is going to be basically working on the server side. So this information or this code here will not be accessible from the browser, and it will be accessible from the server itself. So the ORM connector is basically a script that is used to create a connection between the MySQL database that we're currently using and also the front end. So we just get the information that we are doing here from the config properties, and then we define connection parameters. For example, I'm using MySQL now, so it will use this particular connection parameters, and then it will initialize the pool where, for example, we want to use the pool to get connections to the database. So that is what the server or a mail connector is basically doing. It's just to create a connection between the system and the particular backend that we're basically using. And then our starting point, as I'm indicating, is our PG index, but it's called the browser app because that is what will be the first starting point. So in abstract, we read the config properties, and then we define some of the things that we're going to need, and then we start the JT server here, with those particular settings, and then we make it work. So this is important, reason being that when you run a banana server application, you need to specify arguments for it to run on when you are publishing it. You need to specify arguments so that it doesn't compile the source code. So that is why we need this particular argument here to say that if the argument is 0, there's nothing there on the argument, then run this on this machine, which basically means that each and every time you run it, it's going to recompile, But when you publish the application itself, you don't want it to recompile itself, you want it to run. So you just specify an argument when you making it run with jar. For example, you say jar citosity server, and then the argument will be run so that it doesn't recompile because it's a finalized product. So the transpiler options, of course, we've done that before, but now everything is prefixed with server here. But it's the same structure and format in relation to how we've been doing things. Then what we do is to actually add our handlers here. So what we've created is a server REST API handler, which basically is the backbone of our application in terms of how do we speak to the database. So what happens with this server REST API is you don't have to create individual controllers for your application. You just use the server REST API to speak to your database. It actually links itself directly to whatever table that you want on your database, and it can create CRUD, and it can also create your select statements and all sorts of other things. So basically anything that you need to CRUD for CRUD in your database, you can actually access it directly from the server REST API, and you don't have to write any single controller for it because that process has been done. So for example, now, because this application will be running on the browser, this, for example, here is an indicator that this particular piece of code needs to run a B4J executable code, which basically means that this should be hidden from the browser. So this is the code that will be used internally by the system, which will be hidden by the browser. So as you can see, this is the mix and match of code that will be running on the server and also code that will be running on the browser itself. So when we start the application, we call PG index initialize, which basically is opening up the browser app. But remember, within the app start, we have called open database, which is basically a B4J's code, which is here, so this does not run in the browser at all. It's running on your server. Like, for example, checking the database is uh, connected and all sorts of other things. So these are the things that are happening here. Like, for example, checking database that you see here, there it is there, and then it printed localhost and the DB host, sorry, there it is, and also to other things. So this code, because it's enclosed between if B4J is running at the server and will not be accessible from the client, but through the browser interface, then it will be accessible to the client because we'll be speaking to your database via the handler that we created. So those are some of the things that you need to be considering. So when Banana is ready, that is document loaded, it calls the PG index initialize, which is basically our entry point for our application. So the browser app, it gets initialized. What we have done here for all the pages that are in our application, we have defined them so that they can be accessible within the application itself as the main contact point. For example, we have categories, provinces, the dashboard, and the contact. So we create our pages by prefixing them with the browser so that we know that these are accessible from the client side. Like categories, this is the same code that we've been using before, but because now it's on the Banana server application, what we do is to use class models. In our previous applications, when we were not using Banana server, we created these as code models and we can just get code anywhere we wanted within our application. But because this is a Banana server application, what we need to do is to create them as class models and then initialize them, which is why we have initialize statements everywhere here. For example, we still have load layout here, which basically means that you can create your layouts in whatever format that you want, and then they will be displayed the way that they want to be displayed as indicated here. So what is good about this is you do not have to create your user interfaces by hand. You just drag and drop components within your user interface in terms of the way that you want. For example, here, this is a component that has already been built. It's a drawer. And then we have said to it, there must be a menu, there must be a navbar, there must be a page view. This is exactly the same thing as you are seeing here. There is our drawer here with a menu. There is our navbar here. There's the items of the dashboard. And when you go through each of the pages, it's actually activating each of the pages that you see in our user interface. Like, for example, when you activate categories, it starts this code here. When you activate contacts, it starts this code here. When you activate dashboard, it starts this particular code here. So let's, for example, look in terms of what happens on the browser app. As we were indicating in the browser app, we say when this is initialized, load the base layout in the body of the page. So what happens is with the base layout is this one here. So it loads that on the body of the page, which is what is basically you see here. So the base layout is this part and that navigation. So the fact that you see changes in relation to this particular section of the screen, it basically means that the page view, or what they call a root, is being changed each and every time. But because it's a single page application, the URL there is not being changed. So what we do here now is to load the base layout of our application, and then we load our pages. Now what this one does here is to load the tools that we need for this one. Like, for example, we're saying here at database schemas, you're using font awesome, we're using Excel. These are different JavaScript libraries that we need for our application to work. Like for example, you showed when we were picking colors, we need a color wheel, we need a tag picker, we need an info box, which basically an info box is what you see on the dashboard here, which is what is this? Yeah. So that you can specify the different libraries that you want to use in your application. So what happens also there is to say, we'll use a toast chart, we'll then create the drawer. For example, creating the drawer is saying that in the component called drawer menu, which is in the base layout here, which is basically this one, you know, this is a drawer S2I5 menu. We are saying create the drawer items. So you see a dashboard, contacts, categories, and provinces, which is basically the same thing that you see here. So this is based on how we have been developing this particular application. So as you can see here, nothing much has changed in relation to the methodologies that we've used. Database schemas, we're telling the system these are the database schemas that we use. Of course, we can make the system read this directly from the database, which will be fine. And then drawer item click. So what this basically is saying that each and every time an item in the drawer is clicked, do this. So this one is saying make the navbar visible, open the drawers, which really basically is false. Basically close it. For example, some of the drawers might be visible only on hamburger click when you're using small devices and things. So what it's saying is that each and every time we click on a menu item here, do something. Like for example, if you click on categories, initialize the categories and exit. If you click on provinces, initialize the provinces, because remember, we have created these particular sub pages now as classes. And the reason is we reference them here. PG categories, PG provinces, PG dashboard, PG contact. So we reference them here as classes that are available in our project. And what we're doing here is to initialize them. So initialize them works the same way as show in relation to our previous applications. But because it's a class, we just didn't want to use show now. You know, we just wanted it to be initialized so that it's clear. So these are just other methods that can be called from other classes to actually access this. But the browser app, you need to define it on main so that it's accessible across the application itself, which is why it is here. So any other class that is here can call what is happening in this particular class from main. So main PG index, do something. Like for example, you might say open the drawer, hide the navbar, and all sorts of other things. You know, so these are just some of the functions that are available within the PG index or browser app so that we can be able to access it from anywhere else. Now on categories, as I was indicating, we load the layout, you know, and then you build the categories table, build the categories model, and mount the categories. This terminology is terminology that you know if you've been following our tutorials about the address book. For example, the categories view, which is basically this abstract designer, is having some components in it. It has a categories table, and it also has a model, which is what basically you see when you go to categories. There is your table, and there is your model because you are creating the records, you know. So that is what is happening across this particular system. The tables follow the same premise. They have a table and a model because we are maintaining consistency in relation to how our application looks. But we're using different abstract design views so that we can differentiate between the views themselves. So when we run our application, this will show categories. When we run the contacts, which are big database, these ones, this will show the contact, and you'll be able to add a contact like that. And then when you add provinces and things like that, then the respective information will show on the system itself. Now, build categories table, which is basically that we are saying banana await, which is basically await for that process to complete, you know. So change the title to be categories. The neutral tip will be add category. For example, if you go to categories here, it says add a category and things. So all of this that you see there is actually coded within our application here. So we add a column called color and then color the name, which is basically what you see here. There's the title, there's the color, and it will show the color and the name depending on how you structure it. So if you've been following our Start with Daisy, even 2.4 and before, these kind of coding methodologies are things that we've been following to make things standardized across the board. Now, what happens now when we are loading the categories from the database? Now what this does, we initialize the class REST API, which is basically part of the code that we have. And then what happens is we initialize it with an IP key, and then we get the schema from the database, and then we execute a clear where, and then this is an order by, and then we select all the records, and then the records are displayed within the table itself, which is basically part of the processes that are here. Contacts will do the same thing, categories will do the same thing, provinces will basically do the same thing. What we're doing here is to call the REST API that has been defined in our system. For example, as I'm indicating here, that our REST API, which is basically here, it does everything for us in relation to what we basically need to do. It goes and get access to the database, and you are able to select information from the database and get access to any information that is in the database. For example, we're accessing categories. When it's contacts, we're accessing contacts. For example, there is the same thing as to you REST API. We're accessing categories, and then when we're doing the dashboard, okay, these are the info cards. We add the components, and then where is this thing? Where does it start? Oh, here it starts. Use the REST API, and then open contacts. We execute a count all. In most of the cases, this are count all because what they are doing is basically show us the number of records in the database. Okay. And then here we actually execute a raw SQL command. We're select gender, count star as records from contacts group by gender. So it's basically meaning that all the contacts that are there, select them, group by gender, and count. So basically that's why it's able to give us that. The gender is a female here and everything here. So as I had indicated before, that you can select row, which will basically be executing a raw command that is going to actually execute a statement within our system itself, and then gives us the information that is there. Like for example, here, what we have here are the first letters per person. So what has happened here, we said select letter count as records from contacts group by that, and then we loop through all the records, do while we have a next row, get a letter, get a record, and then add a category letter, and all sorts of other things. So as I'm indicating, all of this information is directly sourced from the database that we're having. Now if we look at the database itself, for example, there are the provinces, these are the provinces that are there. These are the contacts that we've created, these are the provinces, these are the categories, and all sorts of things. So the information is sitting in the database. So we have created a bridge between our browser application and also our backend in relation to how things get done. But to be able to do that, we are calling a REST API directly in relation to calling our classes here. You know, we're calling this particular handler here, which is a universal handler to do CRUD in relation to all our application. So that's why we've been able to actually create this particular full stack application where we're executing reporting, where we're executing CRUD information in relation to our database because of that particular REST API. So like when you create an application with Banano, you are able to say Banano REST API server with PWA, which is basically the format that we use this particular application in. And then we created a handler to be able to access our information from the backend, thus adding this particular handler in our application on main, on main, which basically meant that we added this particular server REST API handler in our application. With that particular handler, we're not able to get access to the back end and everything else. Now, the SQL REST thing that you were seeing there is a class within Banano, Citaso Daisy 5 that actually calls that REST API. So I'm going to open it so that you can see what's happening. I'm not going to discuss the rest of these other pages because most of them are working the same. Then our fake API is what generates the fake data that we're currently using there. You know, this is a code model that we use. And then there's an auth filter here. This is just put here, for example, you know. And then the ORM, which is being used by our backend to build up, and then the REST API, which is actually a handler that we add. Like example, if we can see in relation to this handler, it has we have adopted some of the things from Eric's work that is on the B4X forum. Like for example, the HTTP response content, the CRUD query, you know, and then what else is there? We initialize it, you know, automatically this handler is initialized. So we took some of the content through Eric's help and guidance in relation to some of the things that I have, because Eric did develop some of this code for us, and then we fine-tuned it in relation to it meeting our requirements, you know, so that it works. So there is the handle, you know, and these are some of the things that it does. For example, here it checks whether the API key has been provided. Here, for example, if there's cause that has been enabled, you know, and then the method is post, and then it's query. This is where one is actually executing the secure API query. Like for example, you saw for the dashboard, we're doing select statements and stuff like that. And then here we're actually getting the content that has been passed by the end user. For example, they might pass API records and table, and this is a get, this is a post. Get is for getting records from a database. Post is actually putting stuff in, and put, and basically they will patch it, something like that. And then this is delete. So these are methods that get passed, and then here we're handling the API query. Like for example, you say select star from what, and then you pass your queries, so then it executes the query and everything else. And then what else is here? This is the get list call, which basically see that your get statement is executing properly. And then this is the get ID and all that. This is get by IDs, where you're getting records by IDs. For example, select the fields that you want from a particular table where you are filtering the records. So you can have filters in relation to how you want. If you have been following our PHP CRUD API stuff, you will note that there's some similarities in relation to how that works and how this works, because the idea was to say, if that PHP library that is done by Marius can be created as a handler in B4J, then we have a seamless integration in relation to, if we wrote our project using that PHP API, then we can just simply port our project to Banana Server and it will work. So that was the whole point of actually doing this like this, so that at the end of the day, we're saying to ourselves, porting our program or our app to B4J at least must not take a whole month, because the code must be almost 100% the same. But because this is B4J server, Banana server, then we adopt the code and tweak it in such a way that we make sure that 80% of the code you don't have to change, and then 20% of the code you have to change so that it works with Banana server, which is what has happened here. Because if you compare the other address book applications that we have done, it's the same layout that we've used. We call the same statement like load layout. We do the same thing in terms of loading the records in the database, but what we changed is the class name in relation to which class are we using to connect to the database. So you can do a file diff between the files, and then you will see where the changes are, and you'll discover that the changes are actually very minimal. Now insert one or many, as I'm indicating, Eric helped us to write this particular handler, basing it from PHP CRUD API, so that it reaches the maturity level that we wanted it to reach. It was not an easy process, but we're glad that we actually did it, and it helped in relation to um, helping, in relation to what we want to get into. Like for example, here, single insert, we having an execute query to, and all sorts of other things. So there's some tweaks that I also did, and to make sure that, this just works perfectly. But I'm grateful to Eric for just guiding me out with some of his projects and all sorts of things, so that at least I can learn how to make this thing work. Because for a very long while, I've been trying to make the Banana server applications to work, and I struggled. I remember when I tried to do one application with Banana server, and we had issues with the database connectivity. We were using JRDC, and we struggle so much in relation to making things work, but with this REST API approach, in relation to creating the CRUD application or full stack application, it makes things very easy, because the only thing is to have one handler here, and it will speak to all the tables in your database. You don't have to create handlers for all the tables that you have. You just need one handler to handle all the CRUD functionality of your database. So the premise and the learning here is based on the PHP CRUD API approach, in terms of having one file that is speaking to your database. We wanted to actually achieve the same thing here, to say, let's not write controllers for all tables and all sorts of other things. let's just use one handler that is able to speak to all the tables in the database, be able to do CRUD, be able to do select, and all sorts of other things. And this basically does that, you know. Like for example, here, you know, delete one or many. You are saying delete star, delete from table where the primary key is that. So as you can see, the question mark there is a parameterized query, which basically means that we're trying to avoid as much as SQL injections as much as possible. So yeah, I think what I've not added here is the uh, handling of the schema and all sorts of other things. But basically, most of the things are functional, you know. So this one is to build a select query where you're building a select query from filters. As I'm indicating before, most of the ideas behind this single REST API handler were adopted from the PHP CRUD API because the way that it works so perfectly in relation to one file to rule them all, then this REST API for Banana Server is one file to rule them all too, and also do the rest of the functionalities that we actually need. So it's like a giant API also, you know, because it will have functionality here to do things and all sorts of other things. But the concentration here for now is basically MySQL as the first choice of database that we actually going to use, and then we take it from there. So as you can see, some of the query statements are built as functions, and then they return a CRUD query, which is a tab that we have created here, which will return the SQL statement and also which will return the arguments. And then this is, for example, applying the filters like contains, what equals to, and all sorts of other things. So we've tried as much as possible to make it suitable so that it works in relation to meeting our objectives. But as I'm saying, as long as you follow the structure in terms of the endpoints that you can use to query, to update and delete your records from the database, then everything is fine. The endpoints return responses 200, 400, 401, depending on what is there, you know. So some of these things, of course, are also adopted from JRGC. For example, this one here, you know, the way that it is, we had to go through JRTC and just see in terms of how some of the things were being handled so that we adopted to work properly. So there's been quite a lot of learning that happened around this thing, but it has been an eye opener also at the same time, you know, in relation to how other programming styles can fit into this particular thing, and also what can we add, and all sorts of other things. And one of the other things that we decided to do was to like take this thing through AI and get it to tell us the missing points, the missing loops, the areas of improvement, and also standardization in relation to what kind of things can we add. For example, here is query unsafe, where, for example, you are passing a raw SQL statement in relation to the query that you posted. This detects whether it's actually a select and it forbids some of the things, because with the SQL statement, we can limit it in terms of what is it that it can do, so that at the end of the day, you get your data protected, you know. And then some of these things we took from Eric's libraries directly in terms of when he was building this handler with us, to say that, you know what, these are things that we can easily standardize. So that is how this particular handler works. It's one controller, and it actually accesses all the tables in your database. So we're not looking here at the structure of the tables. We're not doing anything. I mean, I guess at some stage I'll extend it to be like the giant API engine that I'm doing with the PHP API. But the fact of the matter is, at this particular moment in time, the exciting thing is that finally we have confidence in relation to a banana server application that works, that will be able to deploy, that is able to generate reports, because at the end of the day, this is much more secure than the other versions, because most of the code is encompassed in relation to the server itself. But as I'm indicating, the browser part of this particular application is running on the browser. Like, for example, your categories code that you see, all of this code is running on the browser, you know. But the code that is important, like, for example, the one that accesses your backend is running at the server directly, because the server is being accessed by the REST API here. So that's where we're currently at this particular moment in relation to developing banana server applications via a REST API. And the good thing is that at the end of the day, you have one file that is able to do CRUD functionality on your database without having to write many controllers. And the nice other thing is that to develop your user interface, you just use the abstract designer, develop your user interface, and everything is basically there. For example, you will see that within the application itself, contacts, there are events that you can fire up. For example, table add, you know, banana event. So basically, when you click add on the table, which is basically contacts, you know, click add. Ne? So this fires this particular thing here. So what does this thing do? This thing, it pauses the page and then it loads categories, which basically means that the categories that you see here, are loaded directly from the database. And then what does that do? Load provinces, and then it calls add mode. Now let's go to add mode. Add mode, what does it do? It changes the mode to C for create, and then it changes the title of the modal to add contact, which is basically what you see here, add contact. And then what happens is it takes the categories that we loaded from the database as a map, and then it put it on CBO categories, which is basically what you see here, you know. And then set defaults, and then it builds the fake data. Basically, the fake data that you're seeing is this fake data that is produced here, and then it allocates a next ID for that particular contact, because in our database we're using an ID, just hold on, an ID that is 15 characters long, that is unique and everything else, you know. So that is what is happening there. And then what happens is then it shows the model, and then it focuses on the full name, you know. Let's close this one. It shows the model, and then it focuses on the full name. So as you can see, like, you click no, click yes, then events are getting fired. Like, for example, the model, the export of the contacts information to Excel. This is the code that exports the report. So it goes and reads the table from the database. And then what it does is to basically indicate that for each of the columns, these are the field names that you need to write. This is our template of the Excel report. Now, what we've done is create Excel report, contacts report, which is this one here. So what we did was we defined this externally on the program, and then we just put it there so that the system itself, it knows that we are actually generating a report based on this. So you can have whatever pictures you have on your report, format it whatever way you want, and then it will basically write the report there. So, for example, if we want to export this particular contacts report, we just click there, and then it goes and uses that Excel spreadsheet, and then write the contents there. So this is the report that we have. Castro Hester Sloan Lawson, and all sorts of other things. These are the people that are in this particular report. Sloan Lawson, member, blah, 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 blah. So these are the people that are there. So you can generate a report. So as you can see, what we've discussed here is the CRUD functionality, creating records, reading them, updating them, and then deleting them, and then generating reports, which basically is just the full stack application that's basically running on Banana server and via the REST API, and basically meaning that the sky is the limit now. There's no limitations in terms of what we can do, in relation to developing the applications, So deployment, So deploying an application, let's see, this is in B4J workspace. I always forget what this thing is. Here it is, Now deploying an application, this is our code base, and then this is our objects. Then this is what you deploy. Usually you copy the www folder, the avvars, server ini, then this one. What is this one? I don't know. Let me check. All right. Well, I haven't done this in a very long while, so I guess maybe we'll have to uh, deploy that one too, But this is your www folder, and then this is your address book. These are your assets, and then these are your scripts. We've not taken this thing, but as you can see, it's saving everything here inside Status 5, and then there's our starting page, manifest, and then our service worker. And this has basically created an uploads folder for the files that we want to upload. So I haven't tested how that works. But anyway, as you can see here, we have a jar that actually is activated when our application works. We have a www folder. We have the file that we need to deploy in relation to making your thing work. And then you just run your application, and your application will actually show like this and do all the functionality that you need it to do. So that's how far we are with the Banana REST API for CRUD, which has been adopted from PHP CRUD API, which is such a wonderful library. And with the help of Eric, we were able to actually achieve this particular CRUD API that is here. Thank you so much for your time. I'm going to make this available. What I'm going to do, I'm just going to kill this process, and then there's our database. We're going to close it, and then the code is available. I'm going to put it in the forum. Then you can see in relation to how we reached this. And also this works with Citazo 5. So it basically means that you need to have Citazo 5 to actually create this particular application, So let me save this and also then get it available. And then thank you so much for the time.